But first tonight, the forensic detail of the profit figures that expose Anthony Albanese on the cost of living crisis and undermine his cynical tactics to turn supermarkets into villains. The Prime Minister seems to have turned to the playbook of his friend and mentor, Kevin Rudd, to pull him out of political quicksand in this cost of living crisis. Albanese is copying one of Rudd's signature moves from during the global financial crisis, a supermarket price inquiry. This move isn't going to tackle the actual cost of living crisis itself, but only Australians' perceptions of who is to blame for life being so unaffordable. Well, as voters turn against Albanese over cost of living, he's looking to pass the buck. He can't blame the RBA governor anymore. They already sacked Philip Lowe, and their own appointee, Michelle Bullock, is now in the chair. So Albanese is looking to turn the supermarket giants into villains. It's why the Prime Minister has been accusing them of price gouging.
My government is concerned about the price of what consumers pay at Coles and Woolworths and other supermarkets. We want to make sure that consumers benefit from cheaper prices which are being paid. We're dead serious. We find it completely unacceptable that when supermarkets are getting goods cheaper, the prices should go down.
If this idea all sounds familiar, it is because Kevin Rudd did the exact same thing during the global financial crisis. Rudd, who Albanese, as you know, gave the plum job of Australia's ambassador in Washington, despite denying he was going to do so in opposition. And the idea of an ACCC supermarket price inquiry, old and reheated, is straight from Rudd's playbook. Here's the media release from January 2008 from the Rudd government. It says ACCC inquiry into grocery prices. The Rudd government has today directed the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission to commence a formal inquiry into grocery prices. The Rudd government wants to ensure working families are getting a fair deal at the supermarket. But like many of the gimmicks during the Rudd era, this was a hopeless failure. It didn't find major fault with the grocery supply chain, and it achieved nothing, just like the ridiculed fuel watch. And I remember it all well. I was in the press gallery at the time. But not letting the facts spoil a good announcement, Albanese is now forging on with the same inquiry some 16 years later.
The opposition leader wants consumer watchdog, the ACCC, to investigate the pricing policies of Woolies and Coles and put their prices on a website.
Why? Because our working families need information out there about who's offering the best deal.
Mr Howard needs to take action to relieve the pressure on working families rather than simply tell them that Australian working families have never had it so good.
So instead of Albanese cutting spending or lifting productivity to help curb inflation, he's called on the supermarkets to pass on any savings, to pass on their profits to consumers.
The big supermarket chains have been making record profits, and we know that there's something out of sync there. And we say to all of the supermarkets and to big business, they have a responsibility to look after their customers, and my government is prepared to take whatever action is necessary. It's not acceptable to see record profits at a time when people are doing it so tough.
This very clearly seems to be socialist Albanese coming through. Is the Prime Minister really saying that supermarkets can't have profits now, that their profits have to be passed on to customers? The government has no right to tell companies what prices they should set for products, unless, of course, those industries require government licences to exist, which isn't the case with supermarkets. We do live in a capitalist society. But given this does appear to be what Albanese is arguing, it's worth having a forensic look at just how much money the supermarket giants are actually making. Well, Coles' EBIT margin for the 2023 financial year was 4.8%. and it was down slightly from 5% in 2022. And Woolworths supermarket, its EBIT margin for the 2023 financial year was 6%. Now, neither of these figures are spectacularly high. Many industries have much higher profit margins, some of 20 or 30%. Now, remember Albanese blamed Scott Morrison for the cost of living crisis in early 2022 when Albanese was in opposition. But now that he's the Prime Minister, well, it was the RBA governor's fault. Now it's the supermarket's fault, and inflation is all because of global factors. Never mind that Michelle Bullock has warned inflation is increasingly homegrown. Now, that's not to say there's not a problem with price gouging for some products, or that there aren't concerns about a duopoly market. It's not to say that it may not be useful to put extra pressure on the supermarkets to help keep prices down. But the suggestion that the supermarkets are to blame for this cost of living crisis is absurd, simplistic, and wrong. The biggest driver of cost of living is the price of energy and fuel, not the meagre profit margins of supermarkets. This isn't a smart economic policy. It's an embarrassing rehash of a populist idea from a failed Prime Minister in a failed government that repeatedly put gimmicks ahead of substance. And now Albanese is using the same tactic to cover for his own failure to make life more affordable, which was his central election promise during the campaign. A promise that, as you know, he's failed on every measure.